Hello, welcome back to the second installation of Trauma and Poverty in the African American Community. This presentation is sponsored by God's Way Christian Baptist Church of Taylor, Texas, where our pastor is the Honorable Reverend Dr. B.R. Reese. In part with our ministry, Wellness and Empowerment Community Ministries, whose goal is to empower the African American community and educate them around the issues of mental illness. I will begin by asking you to look at this picture and think about what thoughts come to mind. Did you have any negative connotations as it related to the picture? As we focus out on our lens, we can see that the picture is about welfare. Often when we talk about poverty in the African American community, the topic of welfare comes up. Although historically, more Caucasian Americans receive welfare than African Americans. This cartoon depicts the implicit biases around African Americans and poverty. There is a thought that's been shared over the decades that the issues of the African American community stem from character deficits, that they are the issue, and that it's not something deeper. Rather than delineate the perceived flaws of the African American community, I'd like to take a moment to talk about structural racism and how it plays into poverty and ultimately the trauma that many African Americans in our community experience. Structural racism is a system of hierarchy and inequality primarily characterized by white supremacy, the preferential treatment, privilege, and power for white people at the expense of non-whites. As we move forward, I'd like to explore this idea not as a concept, but as a system. Poverty and structural racism work hand in hand. The system controls the keys that would set people free from poverty, those keys being education, housing, and employment. The system is decades old and by design to make sure that white Americans have the better outcomes, to ensure the oppression of Black and Brown people, and it resists change with stalwarts built in that keep the system going. As I discussed in the last installation, the African American community is probably more comfortable with the term poor than poverty. As we see in this chart, African Americans make up almost 50% of low income for the population and 25 for poor or poverty. Many of us rely on the public school systems for education. The public school systems are typically funded by the tax receipts they get from property tax. By redlining most districts where there's a high population or density of African Americans and causing those property values to be low, whereas the white neighborhoods have higher property values, a majority of the tax revenue goes to the districts in those more wealthy, affluent white areas than in areas where there are densities of Black and brown people. As we see in this chart, in 2012, the graduation rate for Black Americans was 70.7, but the graduation rate for white Americans was 86.6. This is largely due to the funding of the school in general. Less funding creates less opportunity for learning. It is important as we move forward that we ensure that all schools are funded equally. As we can see in this chart, of the top 468 colleges and universities, African Americans make up less than 10% of their enrolled freshmen. And for two-year colleges and four-year colleges, they make up 20%. Poverty, for the most part, closes the door to higher level educations for many African Americans due to the cost. And the cost rises with each coming year. It has been said that one of the greatest sources of wealth is property. As we can see in this graph, home ownership rates among white Americans is 78%, whereas home ownership among African Americans is 48%, with a credit denial rate of 45%. This indicates that there are many African Americans who are seeking to hold property but are denied due to credit. It is said that credit is not based in race, but I believe this graph shows otherwise. The last key to poverty is employment. In this graph, it shows that the median earnings for degree holders by racial breakdown is $44,900 for a white person, but a Black person in that same field would make $33,700. So the earnings of the white Americans far exceed African Americans, and certainly Asians receive even higher salaries than white Americans. I would assume this is typically because many Asians hold higher level degrees, that is, beyond the level of bachelor's degrees. So they hold master's and PhD degrees. I'd like to revisit the nexus of trauma and poverty. So a person in poverty can experience trauma that shapes their worldview. In some ways, the trauma and poverty serve as a framework that is ineffective and keeps individuals from having their basic needs addressed and keeps the community from providing the services and support systems that are needed to live a normal life. It creates adaptations which are masked as symptoms and error-based diagnosis for services. Much research has been done around trauma and poverty. And with regards to parent and child relationships, they discovered that in poverty and the trauma of poverty can compromise attachment and mistrust caused by parental withdrawal, which means that they're absent from the home, possibly due to needing to work. It can also compromise attachment through worry and a reenactment of abandonment and certain betrayal themes. How did these issues play out in the lives of family members you know who are living in poverty? It has also been shown that the stress of trauma from the poverty has been associated with ineffectiveness as parents, a limited understanding of child development, increased use of harsh discipline, and high incidence of neglect. As a single Black mother myself, I've always desired to put away the harsh physical discipline that I grew up with, which included extension cords and belts and switches and discipline beyond its useful point. But I also know that I lacked the knowledge of how to discipline based on my child's development at a given point. And not only the knowledge, but also the patience to employ the techniques that are more beneficial for my son. Studies on trauma and poverty have also delved into sibling relationships. That's brother and sister, brother and brother, sister and sister. And they found that those relationships can become quite negative and develop a lot of conflict as part of trauma of poverty. This may be due to a number of factors, that one or more parents has a differential treatment towards one of the children, or the parent's inability to manage the infighting and conflict between the children. Or it's possible that one child may have more needs and difficulty regulating their behavior or their emotions. And it certainly relates to what are the family norms? What are the things that have been handed down generationally as how to manage the children in the family? Research on intergenerational trauma and poverty shows that adults with histories of abuse in childhood or exposure to family violence have problems, emotional problems, anger problems, interpersonal relationship problems, and it impairs their parenting, which can transmit to the next generation, as I discussed a little earlier. It's important to break the cycles that need breaking so that not only can the individual achieve mental health, but they can pass that on to their children as a gift. So, in closing, trauma and certainly adverse childhood experiences related to poverty and trauma have the ability to change our brain development. Those changes cause cognitive, social, and behavioral traits to present that would never have presented otherwise. It leads to outcomes such as poor health and early death. That's why I would like to talk about solutions in installment 3. If you'd like to join the conversation and share these installments of the training, feel free. I've been Nicole Trefan, and I will see you next time.